We cannot trust, migrant workers.
Is there even a guarantee?
It isn't subsidy cuts.
Get her back immediately.
Is this going to be a good plan?
Yeah, I might consent to be a partner, but I don't consent to being abused.
Hello everyone and welcome back to Beyond the Headlines. I'm Hazwin Hassan. First up, is it the end now for cheap, subsidised fuel in Malaysia? Yes, following the Prime Minister's special address on Tuesday night, the government will be rolling out the much talked about fuel rationalisation plan or fuel subsidy rationalisation plan, starting with the withdrawal of blanketed subsidies for diesel. The Cabinet, Anwar announced, has agreed to implement the policy, which will see the country save about 4 billion ringgit annually. This will first only take effect in Peninsular Malaysia. Sabah and Sarawak, for now, are however exempt from the rationalisation exercise as more people there are reliant on diesel-powered vehicles, given the much poorer road conditions in the Bornean states. And later on, in our second segment, we'll discuss the plight of Malaysians being exploited and detained abroad. One case involves 58-year-old Mala Vello, who has had to endure over a decade of domestic servitude and is still serving her prison sentence in Nepal. That and more with my co-host Amalina Kamal later on. Now, back to the rationalisation of fuel subsidies. While the Prime Minister has made it clear the plan will go on, when this will all take effect, however, remains to be seen. Diesel subsidies, the government says, will also continue for certain categories of fishermen. And in essence, the Prime Minister says the rationale behind this plan is to make sure that subsidies are more efficient, targeting only the income groups who really need it. Now, to help me address this issue further, I have joining me in the studio today our resident economist, Professor Dr Geoffrey Williams. Jeff, welcome back to Beyond the Headlines.
Always a pleasure to come.
Always great to have you on. Right, so targeted fuel subsidies, yes. This isn't anything new. We've heard it all before. Past administrations have talked about this to the point of exhaustion. But now the Madani government, they're stepping up and they're doing it. Props to Anwar, do you think?
Yes, is the answer, because we, as you mentioned, we have heard a lot about this from previous administrations, but all that happened was that the subsidies continue to rise and extend, and the total bill becomes unsustainable. So when Anwar became the Prime Minister, he was committed from the start to dealing with this.
Right.
And that commitment is really important because he's putting the full backing of his own position as the Prime Minister and the Finance Minister onto this project. And then we've seen changes in subsidies in electricity, for example, and that saved 4 billion. We saw changes in the control prices of chicken, that saved 1.2 billion. And now we're moving on to the biggest area, which is petrol and diesel, beginning with diesel. But in between, we've also seen the establishment of the PADU, Central Database Hub. And what that will do will help us to target the subsidies more effectively across a bigger group of people. So actually, sometimes people are saying at the moment that the diesel subsidy is the start of the process, but actually it's not the start of the process. I mean, under Anwar, as the Finance Minister and as the Prime Minister, we're well along that road. And what's been happening with the Economy Ministry as well, with YB Rafizi, has to establish the infrastructure for that. So we're well down the road. And what we're seeing now with the diesel is to start at the biggest chunk, the biggest area, but in little bites, in a way, because we're starting with diesel, which is used by relatively few people in the general public, but mostly by people who are in businesses, one form or another. And that means that the initial impact of this won't be too broad across everybody.
So inflationary-wise, this will not have much of an impact on the economy, right?
It shouldn't. And it shouldn't for the following reasons. First, it's subsidy rationalisation. It isn't subsidy cuts. So what that means is there will be savings because of a new implementation system. And the savings are, hopefully about 4 billion. But we expect that the savings could be much bigger than that Because if the new implementation system helps to address the corruption and theft issue, in 2020, that was estimated to be 10 billion. But more recently, 2023, it's estimated at being 4 million ringgit per day. So you multiply that by 365 days, it's closer to 16 billion just for diesel theft. And so if the new system helps to cut that level of theft and corruption, the potential saving is very much bigger. So that's really where we need to focus when we see the details of the implementation plan. So what that means is actually for those people who are using it actively in business in particular, they should still have access to subsidized diesel. And the main change will be to cut out those people who shouldn't have access to subsidized diesel, that is those who don't need it and those who are stealing it. So the idea is to cut back on the people who don't need it and focus. That's what targeting means. Focus it on the people who need it. So what that means is that if you're in businesses, your subsidized diesel costs shouldn't rise very much. As a consequence of that, we shouldn't see that passed on to consumer prices.
So no jump, in general, no jump in your retail prices?
There shouldn't be. There shouldn't be a jump. There might be a mild impact, but there shouldn't be a jump in consumer prices. And if there is, then consumers really have to be wary about that and don't tolerate it. Don't entertain this. If somebody comes along and says, I'm going to increase the price because the diesel has gone up, and it's just not true, buy a product from someone else. Go shop around. Don't take it on face value, because for most companies, by the time it passes down to the consumer, for most companies, there shouldn't be very much of an increase in the cost.
So essentially, you can't really justify if it happens, then people can't justify that because of the rationalization plan, right?
I mean, there is a mild impact. There's no question about that, but it should be very limited. It's not as if they're changing RON 95. If they were changing RON 95, which everybody uses, yes, you expect to have a bigger impact. This is, for consumers and members of the general public, very few people use diesel. Some people do, but very few people use it. Of course, in Sabah Sarawak, like you mentioned, there's a bigger use because of the terrain there. But on the peninsula, there's very few people use that for private vehicles. It's mainly for business vehicles. And they should have access through the various new schemes. They should still have access to the subsidized diesel.
Now, Jeff, I just want to go back to your point on theft and corruption. You brought up the fact that the government loses about 4 million ringgit daily from leakages of the diesel subsidies. And we do know that the smuggling of diesel across our borders, especially in the north, is a huge problem. We do have a smuggling crisis of our cheap fuel, our subsidized fuel. So with this rationalization plan, do you think that it will serve as less of an incentive to de-incentivize, if you may, people from doing this, from corruption from happening and from theft of subsidies taking place? Is this going to be a good plan moving forward to address the issue of theft and corruption, do you think?
It should be easier to deal with. It was Dr. Sri Amir who mentioned that the second finance minister mentioned that number of 4.5 million per day. Of course, it's difficult to estimate because by its nature, it's theft. So it's an estimate, but it is consistent with the very large amounts that we were seeing in 2022, and 2023 is only last year. So it's a very large amount of money. So when we look at the new scheme of how it's going to be implemented, the way we need to judge it is exactly on that issue. Will it help to stop the theft? If it can help to stop the theft, then it's a good scheme. If it's basically the same as it was before, and we're not going to see any particular improvement in enforcement, then you need to question what is the purpose of the scheme.
Because, especially up in the north, our borders in the north, in Kelantan especially, this crisis is still ongoing. There's even in one of our exclusives we reported, there's an exchange of goods like from Thailand, what they can get, for the cheaper fuel that we can offer them. So I suppose this will be nipping it in the bud, essentially, or at least the start of.
It should help to do that. I mean, we don't know the exact details of the schemes, but we know that there might be the use of what's called a fleet card. A fleet card
okay.
is basically a discount card. And what that means is that large companies which are using diesel trucks in particular, haulage companies, supply chain companies, they will buy it in very large quantities. And you would have to use their official card. Now, this has been around for some time on a commercial basis, but it's mainly been for the big companies because they buy a great deal, and it helps them to monitor it, because the truck driver is the person who fills up the truck. So he will then be given a card which restricts how much he can put in.
Right.
And so that type of technology is one of the things that is being proposed, and what we've heard about that will be applied in the new scheme, but now it will be applied to everybody who wants to use the subsidized diesel. The second, of course, is the quota, which is simply to limit the amount that you can buy. And if these schemes are implemented effectively, presumably with some sort of better technology, probably some app-based technology, if they are implemented more effectively, it should help to monitor the use of the subsidized diesel. And then if you're seeing anything that's an anomaly, suddenly somebody is buying too much and more than you would expect them to be able to use, then that's clearly a red flag. And that clearly will help in terms of monitoring and enforcement. So that should be a good way of reducing the wastage, the leakages, and the corruption.
Right. Speaking of leakages, I mean, some critics have questioned, what the proper mechanisms should be like when we talk about targeting welfare and subsidies in this case. So on the issue of mechanism, now you brought up the fleet card. How does this ensure that there's a very low possibility of having middlemen, which will be involved, we'll have to mediate this somehow, in exploiting this and profiting off of the whole scheme?
Well, in principle, it doesn't. Because in principle, actually, what it does, if you have a fleet card, it's a discount card. And I could just pass it to you, in principle.
Right.
I could do that. Or if you have a quota, and I don't use my full quota, I can sell my balanced quota to you, in principle. So, in principle, what you would have is the possibility of a market, if you like, as a sort of a grey market in trading the discounted diesel, but it would be much less.
Right.
Yeah. There are alternative ways of doing it, but the alternative ways of doing it basically involve taking away completely the subsidy and allowing the diesel to go to be sold at the market price, but then recompensating people back. And that would be a form of cash transfer.
Right.
And another way of doing it is to apply the diesel subsidy only for very for very small amounts. And as you're buying more of it, this is tiered pricing. As you're buying more of it, you lose the subsidy. And that will stop you from buying too much.
This is what we have with the electricity
We have
tariffs,
this with electricity, yes.
for the highest income group, right?
But also with highest industrial users. Higher industrial users, bigger industrial users have a lower subsidy on the tariff, on the the per kilowatt hour charge.
Right.
And those who are using less, whether they're small businesses or domestic users, also pay less because they use less. So they pay less per kilowatt hour because they use less in total.
Right.
And only if it's above 600 kilowatt hours domestically, you're going to then be paying more because you're using more. The people who use the most tend to be the more wealthy. But that also has the effect that it will encourage you to be more energy efficient. It will encourage you to use less of it. So it does have a secondary effect, which is to have people monitor the use of the, in that case, the electricity, but in the case of petrol and diesel, it would encourage people to be more efficient in their use of fuel and diesel, and perhaps even move to electric vehicles, so depending on the cost. Yeah.
Right. How do you suppose we monitor? Because you want to see if say we go with the tier pricing method, how are you supposed to monitor the consumption of fuel by groups, right? So essentially we want to say that the more you use, we're assuming that you you can afford, more of it, so you don't need the subsidies, you don't
Yes.
need help, right? So how are we supposed to monitor the consumption of fuel in
Well,
in
because
this
when
way?
you
Yeah.
pump it into your car at the petrol station, it tells you at the pump.
And this goes to some database, central database.
Well,
database?
it would be like this, right? If I go there with my motorbike and I want to put 5 ringgit,
Right.
and I put 5 ringgit,
Right.
I will get the full value of the subsidy. I would only pay 2 ringgit 5 cent for RON95, for example.
Right.
But then if I go there with my big SUV and I want to pump in hundreds of ringgit worth, the first 5 ringgit, I get the full subsidy.
Right.
Then by the time I'm getting up to 20, 30, 40 ringgit worth, or in terms of the number of litres, I'm getting less and less subsidy
Right.
the more that I'm buying. So it becomes more expensive the more that I'm buying. So if you have a normal small family car where you're putting in, let's say, 20, 30 ringgit a day, you probably would get pretty much the full subsidy on that. But if you have a big gas guzzling SUV or something like that, then you're putting more petrol in and then you will pay more.
But how can we offset this against, say, because and I'll come to that in just a bit, with PADU, the central database, concept that we have now in place, we can keep track, the government can keep track, okay, so this is how much, you have depending on you, as in your dependents is how many dependents you have, and this is how much you make, and so, at the end of the day, you don't really have a lot of disposable income. So in a way, the tier pricing, if that's, it sounds pretty straightforward. You have more petrol to fill, more diesel to fill, then it's going to be quite obvious. It will come up on the screen. But how do we then match it with everyone's finances and
Because then you see the subsidy really isn't on the product; it's on the use of the product, right? Okay, so that's and what you're actually doing for people on low income under my preferred option as how you should do it under the PADU scheme is to say, well, we know what your income level is, roughly speaking, and if you are below a threshold income level, you will get a cash transfer. Then you go and you spend it as you choose. If you want to spend it on petrol, you spend it on petrol. You don't want to spend it on petrol, you spend it on whatever it is that's necessary. Right? If you are above that, you don't get, if you're above the threshold, you don't get the cash transfer.
Okay.
You pay taxes as normal. We call this a reverse income tax or a negative income tax or just a cash transfer, right? And what you do then is you stop subsidizing things in terms of subsidy on the product or the service that people are buying, and instead you are helping them with their income. It's a wage subsidy or an income subsidy. And that's not so unusual because during the lockdowns, we had wage subsidies, right? The progressive wage model that is being piloted next month, that's also, it's hands down, it's just a wage subsidy. And basically what it says is that your wage is below what we think you need to have, so we're going to top it up a little bit. You don't top it up completely, you top it up a little bit. And when you top it up a little bit, you say, well, you can spend it on whatever you choose. You want to spend it on petrol, you go ahead, you spend it on petrol. You want to spend it on food, clothes, utilities, rent of your house, whatever it is you want, you spend it on what you want, because then that empowers the individual to decide what they want to spend according to the needs of themselves and the needs of their family, the needs of their kids. And then they're not limited to having the subsidy only on particular products that have been chosen by somebody else. We're going to subsidize cooking oil. We're going to subsidize rice. We're going to subsidize chicken. If I always say this, just to illustrate it with a rather absurd example. If you're poor and you have an air fryer in your house, you get no benefit at all from subsidized cooking oil. Right? So you are simply not receiving the subsidy, right?
Yep.
But if they gave you money, you could buy an an air fryer. And then you wouldn't need to have subsidized cooking oil.
Right.
And
So-
that's the whole point. You give people the money, and then they choose what they want. Then you remove these market distortions, which is to say we're only going to give you a welfare, some sort of welfare support on things that we decide, that we choose,
Yes.
and otherwise we give it, otherwise you don't get the benefit of it.
I mean, I think that, in a sense, translates to we want these people, especially people who need help, to be better off deciding for themselves. What it is they need to do with the money,
And to be empowered.
Yeah, and
to-
it's not a new concept. We've had it with the cash transfers with Brim before, and we've
Yes.
seen somewhat. It serves as the initial buffer, I would say. In helping people out of the extreme, poverty situation that they find themselves in. So, just a little while ago, we were talking about PADU, and I just wanted to get your thoughts on how timely this is, and perhaps this is just part of the process, introducing PADU, making sure it's running, and then now, announcing, although we don't have a date yet, and that's also another thing I would like to ask you about. It all seems a bit, quite well thought out. If
Well,
anyone would,
I think
yeah.
that the biggest challenge is to make the commitment.
Right.
And, the Prime Minister did that from day one.
Mhm.
And once you've made that commitment, you really have to deliver on it.
Right.
Then there are some technical challenges. For example, the introduction of the PADU system.
Mhm.
And actually, despite what the critics said about that at the time, it has been very successful. It has been hugely successful, actually. The number of people who have registered probably captures everybody who is likely to be a recipient of welfare support.
Right.
And most of the people who didn't register are probably people who felt there's no need for me to register because I'm never going to be a recipient. Yeah. It's not always true, because there are still some groups of people who were not captured, who are potentially eligible. People who didn't have access to internet, for example, people who are elderly and are not sure about it, people who are not informed.
Right.
You always have those sort of people. So you always have to constantly reach out to make sure that you're capturing those people. But the registrations appear to me to have been very successful in covering a sufficiently large group of people for the Economy Ministry to feel confident that they've captured the people who are going to be potential recipients. So that has been very successful. And it happened very quickly, if you remember. I mean, how long have we had the unity government? We've had it for 1 full year, then November, and where are we now? May. So we've had it for less than 18 months. Less than 18 months. And yet we have seen subsidy reform in electricity and utilities,
Right.
which have left unaffected 85% of the population, not affected by any increase in electricity prices, but saved 4 billion. We've seen changes in the price controls on chicken, which of course the actual consumer price of chicken has fallen as a consequence. You remove the price control, and actually the
Right.
price falls, right?
Right.
And the price control is supposed to keep the price down, but
Yeah.
actually it had the reverse effect of keeping the price up. And this
Right.
is the perverse problem. This is what economists know for sure is the problem of subsidies and price controls. It has a market distorting effect, which actually keeps the prices up rather than having them brought down through
Right.
competition. So we've seen quite a lot of progress very quickly, and people are still, I think, a little impatient. Perhaps not so much that because they want to see the subsidy reform happen more quickly, because of course if you think about it in terms of petrol, it's likely that the petrol prices are going up. So they're
Right.
not saying, "Yeah, please bring it on because I want higher petrol prices." It's just that they want to be more certain about it. And if they had a clearer timeline, then they might feel a little more confident about planning. And that's certainly one of the reasons why you might say, let's set out a timetable. But at the same time, the government has to make sure, and Dr. Sri Amir said this yesterday, he said they have to make sure that they're going to get it right first before they press the button. So they have to have the right technologies and the right system in place. And that's not just about the design of the policy or the design of the technology. There's a lot of stakeholder engagement that is necessary because people have to be prepared to accept it. You know, if people are going to find it too complicated, or they're going to find that it increases their costs, or they just don't want it for one reason or another, and then you're trying to implement it, you're going to get a lot of pushback, and then that would mean that the policy would fail. So this more staged approach is probably as much to do with getting stakeholder buy-in as it is in terms of designing the technologies, implementing the practicalities of the technology, and designing the policy.
Right. So, in essence, a well thought out plan, and I think in terms of the staging of it, really allows for more people to be prepared to be open to the whole transition, I guess.
Yes, because you have to understand, and I think people have to be realistic about this, and to understand that subsidies do not go to members of the general public. They don't. They do not receive the subsidy personally. I don't receive it personally. You don't receive it personally. That's just it. You do not receive the subsidy personally. The subsidy goes to a company. Right? There is the market price, and then there is the consumer price. The difference between that is the subsidy. The subsidy goes to the company. And that means that a very, very large number of people are making money out of the subsidy business. Very large numbers of people are making very, very great amounts of money out of the subsidy business. And when you have this tens of billions of ringgit, where in terms of the total subsidy budget, not including the illicit activity as well, then you have to realize that there are a lot of people who are going to push back if you are going to try to change that quickly, because they are going to lose a lot of money very quickly.
Right.
And they are not going to allow that to happen. Right? So the government has to deal with that as a very pragmatic challenge. You know, it's all very well for economists to say this is how it's done in theory, or even for technologists to say, well, here's the app, or here's the card.
Yep.
You know, that's all relatively straightforward. But when you see some guy who says, no, hold on, I'm going to lose millions because this system has changed. It's the change management process.
Right.
If they're going to lose millions, they're going to push back. They're going to stop it. They're going to sabotage it, for sure.
Right.
And that's why it has to be done in stages, because of the simple pragmatics of the reality, the real politics of it. You know.
Right. So just a quick one before we wrap up, because we are really running out of time here. Now, you mentioned about the very minimum inflationary impact it was this starting with the diesel rationalisation plan, subsidy rationalisation plan would have on the economy, and I think echoing your thought would be most of the other experts saying that what we really need to watch out for are the details on the RON 95 petrol subsidy, which will obviously affect the much larger chunk of the population. This will have a bigger inflationary impact on the economy. So your thoughts, Jeff, to wrap this up?
Well, I mean, it will remove, in principle, it will remove the subsidized price, so the price will rise. If that's done overnight, you're going to have a big step, and then it will stop rising. It will just go up and down according to the market price. If it's done more slowly over time, then you would have a more muted impact. And that requires quite a lot of economic modeling. You also have to look not just at the price of the petrol, but the price of other products. If the price of other products is going down and the price of petrol is going up, the general price level is compensated, because those other prices are actually coming down. So the timing of it is actually quite sensitive in terms of economic policy, and you can actually get it right. If you get it right, the impact there is going to be an impact. There's no question it's going to be an impact. But the impact would not necessarily cause a huge spike in inflation.
Right.
But it's all about timing.
So timing is essence of it all, I guess.
Yes, it is. And it's all about what is the global oil price.
Yeah.
If the global oil price came down significantly, right, then you could remove the subsidy, allow it to float, and actually the difference between where we are now, 2 ringgit 5 sen, and the market price would be relatively small. So if the global price came down, then
would you say timing above the mechanism? Like mechanism is secondary at this point. Is that what you're also trying to say?
No, well, actually, the mechanism isn't. I mean, there are many different mechanisms. My preferred is as we mentioned before, is the tiered pricing.
Right.
But I am persuaded by people who know the details of the retail petrol business that, of course, they're going to say it's not as easy as that because there are fingers in pies and it's not so simple.
Right.
From a technological perspective, an economic perspective, it's very straightforward. But they are saying, for example, most petrol stations are not owned by the petrol company. They're franchises owned by small business people. So you have to understand what was the effect of that on their revenue. Right. You know, it's not that there's anything malevolent going on. It's just that they're going to say, if these petrol prices are going to go up, I'm going to see fewer people coming in. And I don't make so much money selling the petrol. I actually make money when they come into the shop, right? And if I'm seeing fewer people, then that's going to affect my overall revenue. And all right, you need to take that into account when you're dealing with the timing and the mechanisms. And that again is something that needs to be handled delicately because you are dealing with SMEs. You may think you're dealing with big multinational oil giant companies, and why don't you just implement it and let them take the hit? But actually you're not. I mean, these petrol stations are franchises. That's all they are. Yeah. And they're actually mom and pop shops in some instances, particularly in more rural areas. They're just small businesses like many others.
Yeah. Well, I guess that pretty much wraps up our discussion on the fuel or diesel rationalisation plan for today. Of course, as this progresses, I'm sure that we can call you back on.
I'm sure that it will progress relatively
fast, do you think?
Quickly.
Yeah.
Now, I think that by the time of the next budget and into next year, we will be well into this. We will be seeing periodically new innovations as you know, in a sequence. Various of the subsidies are removed in stages or removed completely.
Right.
So I think we're well into that process and the momentum will pick up.
Perhaps the next time we have you on is when we have a date when the rollout will begin. Well, thank you so much again, Jeff. As
You're
ever,
welcome.
great to have you on set today and to help me discuss this fuel subsidy issue. Well, stay tuned for our viewers at home. We still have our second segment coming up with my co-host, Amalina Kamal. Don't go anywhere.
Hello everybody, thank you so much for still sticking in to Beyond the Headlines. My name is Amalina Kamal, your host for this segment, and today we're going to discuss a critical issue in which highlights the plight of human trafficking victims and the ongoing efforts to bring them justice. Now, we are here to shed light in particular on the heart-wrenching case of Mala Vello, a Malaysian citizen who was trafficked under domestic servitude and imprisoned in Nepal following her escape. Now, after being trapped in domestic servitude for 10 years, Mala now faces a 7-year prison sentence for overstaying her visa. She is serving her sentence at the central jail in Suntara, Kathmandu, and described her captivity as hell on earth. Now, those who are fighting for her release see it as a grave injustice and demand attention as well as action. Now, with that, let's turn our attention to the dedicated team working tirelessly to bring Mala home. We have representative from Project Liberate, Program Officer Melissa Chin. Welcome, Melissa, to Beyond the Headlines.
Yeah, thank you for having me here.
Thank you. Also here on set, we have our very own Human Rights Commission of Malaysia, SUHAKAM Commissioner, Mr. Ragunath Kesavan. Welcome, Mr.
Thank
Ragu,
you.
to Beyond the Headlines. Also, we have our reporter who broke the news on Mala Vello. We have Ilya Masha Iskandar, NSC reporter on Beyond the Headlines. Thank you, Masha.
Thank you for having me.
Right. I want to, start off the discussion with all the introduction and breaking the ice, but unfortunately, this is a serious case, and I think we should, give it to not just Mala but other victims of human trafficking and exploitation. The space to highlight or at least explain their plight to people. Maybe can we start this off with Mr. Ragu? Mr. Ragu, in terms of human trafficking, how important is it to identify the victims correctly here first?
I think the difficulty is that, firstly, once you're overseas, you feel trapped. You're a foreigner. You don't have money. Generally, people who are trafficked would be people in the B40s, as you call it. They won't know what their rights are. And the difficulty is that they're totally dependent on the person who would have brought them into the country, either in a form of a relationship. So most cases would be people who are brought in legally as a tourist or whatever it is, as a partner, intention to get married. Then obviously, abuse can happen. And the victim per se has a very little avenue to voice their complaint, in a sense that, number one, lack of access to resources, and more often than not, they would have overstayed. And the fear is that if I now go to the authorities, I would be prosecuted for overstaying. So those are the difficulties you have. And because you're dependent on someone in a relationship, even in your host country, Malaysia for instance, it's so difficult for a victim of domestic abuse to voice and come out and complain. What more when you're in a foreign country? It is extremely difficult.
Commissioner, I just want to understand, how can we engage better with international level authorities here to at least update their human rights regulation to follow the UN or at least the Palermo Protocol here?
I think we have the same problem here as well. With the authorities, it's easier for them to charge someone for overstaying rather than delve into the complexity of whether this person has been trafficked. These standards for trafficking, factors that you take into consideration, withholding passport is considered trafficking. It's an indicator. So very basic things, right? If you are a domestic helper and you're not being paid salary, that could be considered as being trafficked as well. So it's very broad and wide, the factors that can be taken into consideration. If you're not allowed to leave the house or a place of residence, for instance, that is considered trafficking. So the definition of being trafficked or human enslavement has actually been widened. So in a sense that if you are held in any form without access to a third party, even deprivation of a mobile phone can be considered trafficking. The issue is that, are the authorities trained sufficiently? Is there enough resources? Would they be able to support a prosecution of someone who's being trafficked? And you also have the dynamics of the trafficker being a person in a better position in terms of money, resources, connections, and the victim would be the most vulnerable, mostly women. And on top of that, you have no access to money. So those are the problems we have.
Right. Let's move to Melissa. Melissa, okay, with the BawaMalaPulang campaign, right? I think it highlight the plight of Mala Vello in specific here. But maybe Project Liberate can share more in terms of how this campaign actually aims to create better advocacy, better attention, not just to Mala's case, but the whole risk of being exploited.
All right. So this case was actually referred to us by another NGO friend, which is North-South Initiative, or NSI, around late December last year. So this BawaMalaPulang campaign is our effort to get the public to amplify Mala's case, because one, she is a Malaysian who is unfairly detained for something that is not even her fault, and secondly, because she's a victim of human trafficking and also forced labor exploitation. So our main goal with this campaign is to bring Mala back home, and which is why we want to work together with MOFA, or Ministry of Foreign Affairs, to bring her back as soon as we can. And when that happens, hopefully we will be able to set a precedent for what the government is willing to do to bring back our citizens, especially the trafficking victims who are unfairly detained. And we also want to highlight how romantic partners can can be the perpetrators of human trafficking cases and not necessarily strangers or big syndicates as what is always portrayed in the media. And at the same time, we hope that Mala's case can encourage both Malaysian and Nepali governments to improve their legislation on human trafficking.
Right. And what sort of obstacles have you faced so far, or at least milestones in this particular campaign since you launched it?
What sort of obstacles?
Like challenges in terms of,
since working on Mala's case?
Since pushing the campaign forward.
I think that's something we are still working on at the moment. I would say it's mostly getting the endorsement and the support of people in power, and there's also the negative comments that you can see on news coverage of Mala Vello, because some people see it as something that is her fault to begin with, without even fully understanding that Mala is a victim. She was deceived and exploited by her trafficker.
Commissioner, do you want to add to that?
We have the International Transfer of Prisoners Act, which was passed in 2012. Unfortunately, Nepal is not part of the bilateral arrangement. Malaysia has with Thailand, Philippines, few other countries, but not with Philippines. So one of the things that we would urge MOFA to do is to increase the number of countries to enter into bilateral agreements. Therefore, if you have a Malaysian who's serving a prison sentence in Nepal, can be sent back to Malaysia to serve a prison sentence. Then obviously once you're in Malaysia, you can seek pardon or whatever it is, and the SUHAKAM has been approached on Mala Vello's case as well. So we've worked with the Nepali Human Rights Commission on this matter, but unfortunately the legal process has not been so kind to Mala Vello, in a sense that the authorities there have chosen to prosecute her for overstaying and refuse to look at it as a trafficking victim. So that's a big problem. In a sense that I know some diplomatic efforts are being taken. The consular in Nepal, the Malaysian consular, has been helpful, but there's quite limited options available for us, because in a sense it is up to the domestic laws of each particular country. But what we can do is, number one, raise awareness of trafficking, right? And every Malaysian who leaves the country must be aware of these issues, especially when you're in a relationship. You need to get more information, more protection for yourself to ensure that, And I think one of the easiest things anyone can do, if you intend to go into a relationship with a foreigner and you want to go back to his or her country, is to at least register with the foreign mission, Malaysian foreign mission in those countries. In a sense, then you'll have some record, and the family can then, contact the mission to say, my mother is here or my father is here. Can you please, find this? A lot of times, problem we have is records and information. There's not sufficient information to trace where this person is. To say that my mother or my sister has been gone to Nepal doesn't help much, because every country is so huge in a sense, right? We need more information. If that person had registered, at least then would have made things a bit easier for parties. But all said and done, we shouldn't look at and moralize to say that he should or shouldn't have gone. If a person is in love and that's a path they choose, and with complete and total confidence in the partner, and then it became abusive. So that's the difficulty we have.
Melissa, I just want to draw the attention back to you as well. Do you think the Malaysian government is actually doing enough at this point of time to bring attention to Mala's case?
Our hopes for now is to really get more fast collaboration with us, because so that they can kickstart the government to government initiative to try to bring Mala Vello back.
Okay. Tamasha, during your time reporting, were you able to gain statistics of the visibility of actually how many people in Nepal is affected?
When I was reporting on Mala, I was gathering information particularly on Mala herself, but I have also talked to the consulate in Nepal, and he did mention that there are a few other cases of not necessarily trafficking, but women going into marriage with a Nepali man, and then the husband, I would say, then started working overseas, and then the woman left with the in-laws, or trap, I would say, because their passports are with their husbands. So but I feel like a lot of these marriages are actually custom marriages instead of legal marriages. So that actually brings, they cannot have their spouse visa, I would say. All of them are entered through tourist visa, and this is why I feel Malaysians, or we don't really have that awareness, particularly on not letting anyone withholding our passport or being in possession of our passports. By withholding their passports, you're actually asserting power over someone, saying like, actually, I'm in control of you. If you don't follow my orders, then I will actually then you cannot go anywhere, you cannot go back home, whatever it is. You are somewhat delivering that message that you are enslaved to a person. So I feel that that's actually a culture in Malaysia, and it shouldn't be. And so these are what's happening out there. Even though this is only in Nepal, I feel, and there are also cases where people in Cambodia Malaysians going to Cambodia and actually being trafficked there for job scams. They are actually somewhat scammed and then imprisoned also for overstaying. I don't feel like Mala's case is quite isolated. Maybe isolated in the sense that she is a wife. She is in a domestic setting instead of a work setting. I actually also read the comments on my own stories, and but I feel like people should also understand that nobody can consent to being trafficked. I might consent to being a partner. I might consent to being a worker, but I cannot consent to being exploited.
Right.
So it should deliver a message to these people.
Right. I suppose to simplify or to look at it very more simply is that, yeah, I might consent to be a partner, but I don't consent to being abused, whether mentally or physically in that sense. And as you mentioned, Mr. Ragu, withholding someone's passport is actually a form of trafficking, and I don't necessarily think a lot of people realize that. Now, before we get into further into our discussion, we do have an interview clip with YB Senator Sivaraj earlier that I had. Again, I would like to thank everybody for your shares first, but let's roll the clip from YB in terms of how he has been helping the initiative when he heard about Mala's situation.
We were told about Mala and how she went there and so on. So I need to know exactly what was her issue like. So documentations and explain to me with some evidence that she was charged under the Immigration Act because of overstay, nothing else. So then I decided maybe we can help her, talk to the immigration here through a foreign ministry. And then also I got in touch with our Consul General in the officer named by Firdaus, if not mistaken, in Nepal. But Firdaus been very helpful because I called him and he's aware about this that person, Mala, and according to him, he said there were like about 5 to 6 cases in Nepal, similar cases. One of them, by the name of Nataraja, managed to bring this matter Supreme Court, and he won the case. So that can be used as a precedent in Mala's case. So that gives us a hope. Okay, so I'm trying to work out with him, and Firdaus is arranging a lawyer, which basically agreed to do pro bono for Mala if Project Nataraja, the Nataraja case is successful. Let's wait. I really hope that Nataraja can be released. Basically, according to Firdaus, the court has agreed to release him, but now they are waiting actually for Ministry of Finance of Nepal to give waiver for that penalty. So they're not sure whether they will give a full waive or they still have to pay some kind of penalty. So it depends on the case. So then we will use the same precedent to help Mala. But only thing concerning me now is it's time consuming. So that's the reason I wrote to Mat Hassan, Foreign Minister. Immediately I told him that we need some a diplomatic channel to talk to Nepal government to expedite the whole thing. But I've never received any reply from the Foreign Ministry. But fortunately, when we contacted directly the Consul General, especially Mr. Fidaus, he gave us a very, good cooperation, and I'm working through him. So I'm talking to him, we can help Mala and to bring back her, bawa pulang Mala sebelum Deepavali.
I also did ask YB Senator in terms of, how Firdaus Azman, the council representative in Kathmandu, Nepal, has been actively helping in, expediting Mala's case. And this is also what he had to reply.
Firdaus gave us a very good feedback, and he said he's looking into matter, and he's like, even when the day I called him, he was talking to the lawyer, tried to convince him to do pro bono for Mala if Nataraja's case was succeeded. Nataraja won the case. The only thing is now pending from the Ministry of Finance from Nepal whether whether he can be granted a full waiver for the penalty or he has to pay some kind of penalty. So once we conclude that, the Nepal Finance Ministry conclude that and they give a full verdict, then we know what to do with Mala's case, and the lawyer can use that as a precedent to help Mala. So that's what we are waiting, and I'm not sure about the timeline. I don't know how the judiciary and also courts works in what they call in Nepal. So that's why I immediately wrote to Mat Hassan, Minister of Foreign Affairs, so that we can use a diplomatic channel to expedite the whole thing. So that we can have results faster and we can bring her back as soon as possible.
I did ask YB Senator on what basically his experiences for cases such as this, like how many, since he was previously with MIC, people have come forward to talk about matters such as this, and this is also what he had to reply.
Nepal is just first case for me. I've done India, I've done some from Africa countries and so on. So Africa will be very tough because you don't have anyone, you don't know anyone. You have to use a diplomatic channel, but believe me, there's a lot of cases in Africa. Our women stuck in African countries, so it's difficult. Yeah, that's some of my experience.
So what YB mentioned earlier for the cases that he was approached with, we still have a lot of Malaysians going abroad being tricked with this whole promise of love thing, and this is where the idea of trafficking gets very complicated because it's never clear cut. Your trust is broken, and you're suddenly being held captive against your will. So, Mr. Ragu, I just want to understand from your point of view. Of course, we do not want to blame the victims, but we need to start from earlier on, teaching our young and stuff.
I think going back to basics again, gender equality is important, right? I think ratification of the international covenants are very important. Ensuring gender equality is very important, and mostly in a relationship situation and traffic, it would be the women, right? And at what point do you consider yourself trafficked? You'll always be in a relationship, then you'll say, look, I'm not happy, I'm not comfortable, But I think the issues are cultural. We are all taught or culturally brought up to say that the woman is, to serve the man. So in your own way, you feel that, maybe what wrong have I done? I should improve myself in the sense, right? So, but I think generally, if you're in Europe, for instance, say the Siti Aisyah Abdul Wahab case, she was in a similar situation, domestic servitude, beholden to this man who kept her captive for 30 years. He was prosecuted, right? And it was seen as trafficking. No issue, no excuses, traffic. We have situations, even in Malaysia, it is extremely difficult to get the authorities or the enforcement agencies to prosecute someone for trafficking. A clear case of trafficking is you're brought in and you're working in a bar or nightclub or whatever, then it's traffic. But an employer can be a trafficker as well. If you bring the person into work, you don't provide accommodation, you don't provide salary, you don't pay wages, and you keep them in prison, that is trafficking. But we have brought situations like that to the authority. They refuse to prosecute. They merely look at it as a breach of contract situation, and therefore you must go ahead and do something. Coming back to Mala's case, you know, when looking at the Malaysian situation, if the final court has given an award or sentence or whatever it is very difficult or nearly impossible for any other agency to reduce the fine. They would not have the powers. That would be interference with the judiciary. So the fine stays. So the question now is, unless they have a pardon system, like what we have in Malaysia, the Pardons Board, that can be reduced or whatever it is. Again, that takes time. So my suggestion is, Mala's situation is a minor misdemeanor in law, misdemeanor. It's a mere overstaying in Nepal, and the fine is 88,000. So I think one option we should seriously consider is that because of the age of Mala, she's 57, 58 this year, and she hasn't seen her family for 10, 12 years, we should do some form of crowdfunding to ensure that we raise this money as soon as possible to get her back to Malaysia. And her family is very poor, they are not in a position to pay any part of the fine even, and to wait for the authorities to start the process. We know how it is in bureaucracy. It's going to take 2 years. She's already spent 2 years in prison. Yeah. Another 5 years to go. So best thing we can do, 80,000, 85,000, I think Malaysians will have it in their hearts to donate for this cause.
Right.
That much I believe.
I mean, but I want to ask you this as well, because then you will have criticism saying that, okay, if we find one person, that what singles out one person's case from the rest? Should there be better, I suppose, implementation of actually creating a reserve fund?
It should go on a case-to-case basis. This is not, we're not seeking government funds. Right? We're not saying that the government should set up a fund to assist. What the government should and must do is to strengthen their consulates and embassies with proper legal support and get local lawyers to assist as well. I mean, I'm a lawyer, I know. If we have a British citizen in lockup, immediately a lawyer turns up, right? We have Bangladeshi workers and Nepali workers in lockups or immigration, nobody turns up. So what we want for Malaysians is that they must have that confidence that their embassy or their consulate in different countries would be able to assist them. Many forms. We shouldn't say that, get a lawyer pro bono. If you're assisting a Malaysian citizen, why must that lawyer do pro bono work? Right? Even Indonesians in Malaysia, the Indonesian embassy pays lawyers to do work. To expect lawyers to do pro bono, I think is not fair to the lawyers, right? And the quality of service that will be given, right? So in Mala's case, the difficulty I have is that if it's reached the highest level in terms of the legal process, getting the fine reduced is not up to the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. No way would the Ministry of Foreign Affairs be involved. That would be interference with the judiciary. I'm looking at the Malaysian scenario, and it probably applies in Nepal as well.
Right. But they are trying to seek, I suppose, clearance not necessarily from the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, but from the Finance Ministry as well. This is going back to the case where apparently Nadaraja Ramasami's case, if let's say he's able to be released and then the penalties will be waived, then the same application would be brought on Mala's case. So in this particular context, it goes back to the local country that detained Malaysian citizens here. So my question is that how do we ensure the states who are actually obligated to follow UN ruling for all this sort of like human rights, I suppose, safety net, to actually update their own local legislations?
I mean, that's very important. I mean, we don't do that as well in Malaysia. We treat people who have overstayed as people who have overstayed, regardless of whether they are victims. That's the difficulty we have in Malaysia as well, right? So the standards that must be set must be very high. If you are in UK, Siti Aisyah Abdul Wahab was never charged for overstaying. That's the standards we should strive for, right? How is it that she was immediately accepted as a victim, and she was treated as a victim, given all the support, and the perpetrator, the person who kept her in such a post, prosecuted. That's the standards we should have, and that's the standard we should strive for all nations. I think for Malaysia, we have this good step, the International Transfer of Prisons Act.
I mean, you mentioned earlier.
Yeah, that's very important. It's a great step taken by the government, 2012. So Malaysians held overseas can be brought back. So
But you want to expand this.
yeah, so we need to expand that, especially looking at countries where perhaps you feel that there's not much protection for foreigners. Those are the countries you need to have some kind of arrangement immediately. That would be very helpful for the nation.
So we're looking at what, tier 2 countries, what sort of
At
countries?
the
or
moment, I
association?
think we have about 12 countries, 12, 15 countries.
So,
But a lot of the countries do not prosecute anyone for overstaying.
except for in this case lah, in this.
No, but
yeah.
Australia doesn't have, UK doesn't have, US doesn't have, Canada doesn't have. What they do is the moment you're caught for overstaying, you're deported immediately, because it's a burden on the state and everything else, right? So we don't want people to stay.
Costings
Yeah,
and all that,
costing
because
and
then you will be bloating the prison system also.
Yes.
So those kind of consideration lah. Okay, we want to just quickly roll a clip from Mr. Firdaus Asman himself, because you're talking about standards just now, right? But at least this is the standard that the embassy in Nepal is trying to push for, and at least helping in releasing not just Mala but other Malaysians who are probably being exploited and still detained.
Saya juga telah mengadakan pertemuan dengan Foreign Secretary di Kementerian Luar Negeri Nepal untuk membuat follow up basically kedua-dua warga negara Malaysia yang dipenjara ni, dan juga Cik Nada Raja ni, dan kita dimaklumkan beberapa proses yang perlu dilalui. Pertamanya, pihak Ketua Pengarah Immigration Nepal ni, dia setelah menerima Supreme Order ni, dia perlu panjangkan ke Kementerian Dalam Negeri Nepal, ya, sebab Ketua Pengarah Immigration dia hanya boleh membebaskan mana-mana warga negara yang tinggal lebih masa ni hanya setelah mendapat kelulusan kerajaan. Dia perlu datang daripada Kementerian Dalam Negeri, ya. So dia telah panjangkan kes tu, disahkan ada Supreme Order ni, dan dipanjangkan ke Kementerian. Kita mengadakan perjumpaan dengan Foreign Secretary itu tadi. Kita dimaklumkan proses dia ialah setelah kes ni dipanjangkan ke Kementerian Dalam Negeri Nepal, Kementerian Dalam Negeri ni dia perlu consult pula dengan Kementerian Kewangan. Sebabnya kes Cik Nada Raja, which is sama juga dengan Mala Vello, melibatkan hasil negara dia lah. Jadi perlu mendapat kelulusan daripada Kementerian, maklum balas daripada Kementerian Kewangan ni, sama ada denda dia ni dikurangkan ke. Dia perlu mendapat maklum balas daripada Kementerian Kewangan terlebih dahulu. Barulah Kementerian Dalam Negeri ni boleh buat keputusan sama ada dia ni dibebaskan macam tu saja atau masih lagi dengan denda. Dia boleh dibebaskan subjek tu still kena bayar denda lah, macam mana. So kemudian lepas dah ada keputusan daripada Kementerian Dalam Negeri dan dengan maklum balas daripada Kementerian Kewangan ni, Kementerian Dalam Negeri perlu kebentangkan ke Parlimen dan dapat kelulusan Parlimen, barulah Kementerian Dalam Negeri boleh arahkan Ketua Pengarah Immigration untuk bebaskan. Sebab tu kita tengah monitor kes ni very closely. Kita sedang bukan saja monitor, tapi kita ada perjumpaan dengan Foreign Secretary. Sekarang ni kita dah pun mohon untuk berjumpa dengan Home Secretary pula. Kita sedang menunggu appointment untuk jumpa Home Secretary untuk kita buat follow up berkenaan ni. Kedua-dua rakyat Malaysia ni, khususnya Cik Nada Raja ni, sebab dah ada Supreme Order ni. Dan lanjutan daripada pertemuan dengan Foreign Secretary itu, Kementerian Luar Negeri Nepal telah pun mengemukakan recommendation kepada Kementerian Dalam Negeri supaya membebaskan kedua-dua rakyat Malaysia ni. So Kementerian Luar Negeri dah kemukakan that recommendation, dan sekarang ni basically menunggu Kementerian Dalam Negeri lah.
Alright. I mean, we've heard what Mr. Firdaus had to say. I just want to get Melissa's reaction out of this first.
I guess one thing, the next question will probably be how long will that process take? Yeah. And how much longer does Mala have to wait for all this to happen? Yeah. And is there even a guarantee? Yeah.
You want to say something?
Oh yes. I think in my discussions with Mr. Firdaus just now and throughout the month, they do have some issues in terms of political uncertainty, because he said that Nepal keeps on changing ministers, changing the government. So every time that he makes an appointment with a person, with the minister, keeps on getting pushed back because of, it changed persons. So it changed jurisdictions and all that. So I feel like it will take quite some time. So there's a necessity for our government to put more pressure on Nepalese government to actually sign this off quickly. I feel in that sense. Referring to what you said just now, I feel Malaysia is moving towards the right direction in the sense that they have amended the Atipsom Act in 2015 towards a more victim-centered approach. But this is not, this is only in Malaysia, but not what happens if Malaysians are trafficked outside. So I feel there's a necessity for all governments, all countries to have we cannot be punishing the victims twice. They are already a victim. Why are we charging them with overstaying? Why are we, failing to acknowledge that they are victims? They are human trafficking victims. Even though I feel like in the UN definition of trafficking is it's actually a 3-paragraph definition. There's exploitation, domestic servitude, whatever it is, however it is that you are confined, that you are that is against your will. That would be best. Human trafficking cases now, I feel that it's not so rare, and it evolves over the years. There's a lot of ways people can be trafficked to, just a social media promotion. Come work with us. But when you after you're going there, it's actually not the ideal, not your most ideal situation, and then after that you are trapped.
Masha raised a really good point. How can nations, at least when it comes to within the region, work better towards achieving an ideal state of protecting rights of human beings here we're talking about,
Again, using Mala's case as an example, and the response from Mr. Firdaus, he doesn't seem to have so much confidence that it's going to be done in the near future. That's number one. And I was surprised that it requires the approval of Parliament. If you go by the Malaysian standards, which is pretty good, it takes 6 months or 1 year or 2 years. So I don't know how that's going to happen in Mala's case. I'd still go back and say we should do crowdfunding, get her back immediately. It's not a huge amount of money. It's 88,000. It's not 880,000. And her offense, she did not commit a crime in Nepal. She wasn't involved in trafficking of drugs. She didn't murder anyone, Her only crime was overstaying. I mean, that's something that I feel it's something that we should all focus on, get Mala back. And in terms of what Malaysia is doing, we should push ASEAN on an immediate basis to ensure that the laws on trafficking is enforced. We have good laws. 2015 it was amended, but my personal view, enforcement is still lacking.
Right.
We do not prosecute. How many employers have been prosecuted for trafficking?
Not just on the national level, or you're talking about regional level as well?
National, Malaysian.
Malaysian level
so
first.
At the moment, trafficking is merely for domestic abuse. An employer who abuses his maid or helper gets charged. But on a different, even then, they do not charge you for trafficking. They charge you for causing hurt and things like that. But the severe punishments are in Atipsom, right, where you get severe penalties. So that's there to show, but it's not enforced in Malaysia.
Right.
That's SUHAKAM's view as well.
Right.
It's not enough enforcement. We should make sure that our laws which are there, good laws, are enforced properly and to ensure that victims are protected. That's very, very important for us.
Melissa, because you've been, engaging very closely, not just with Mala, but also the daughter, maybe you can provide a little bit insight in terms of like how she is coping.
I'm stating the obvious, but Uma deeply misses her mother. I mean, her mother was gone for 12 years, and during the first year that Mala was in Nepal, she couldn't even get hold of her mother. And it was only until she finally got a call back from Mala, and it was because her trafficker was asking for money with the excuse of wanting to renew Mala's passport. So the trafficker was well aware that Mala is deeply worried about her visa status, and he used this vulnerability to deceive not only Mala but even her own daughter back in Malaysia. Yeah. So in the end, Uma made several transactions to the trafficker, but the visa was never renewed and is reported to be lost under the trafficker's possession. Yeah. And when Mala was still staying with the trafficker, they didn't get to talk that much. And funnily, now that Mala has been in prison since 2022, they got to at least call once a week. And while she was still with her trafficker, Uma wasn't aware of how deep the extent of the abuse that Mala faced. It was only when we got on a phone call with Mala together with her daughter, that was when Mala told us that she feels so much more safer in prison compared to when she was staying with her trafficker. And that was when Uma broke down because she felt guilty that she couldn't identify the abuse that her mother had gone through.
Again, the number of Malaysians actually being affected, abroad, we don't know. I mean, let's not just talk about countries like Nepal. Let's talk about within the region. I mean, globe especially. We don't know to what extent until they, come to the embassy, they report themselves and everything. So maybe just one last comment from you, Mr. Raghu, in terms of, let's say, if you feel that you are, if let's say anyone here is tuning in, they feel like they are a victim of something, how can they open themselves up to actually come forward here?
I think the first step is to approach the embassy or the consulate. That's the first step you do. And there are enough NGOs in different countries who actually get involved in trafficked victims. So you should be able to get in touch with any of them. So that would be the start. Sometimes the fear of going to the police is that you will be detained and you will be charged for whatever offense, right? So the best thing is that ensure that you are in touch with the consulate or embassy, register. I know the foreign mission tells us this all the time. Whenever you reach a country, whatever it is, get in touch, especially when you're working in these countries, right? Get in touch, register, and they will keep a tab on you, in a sense, you haven't come, you haven't done, how are you, and things like that. So that's very, very important. So the networking is important. But the difficulty would be when someone who is from the B40, if you don't have access to internet, you don't have access to you can't read and write, the literacy situation is also very important. So it's sad to hear that in this age and this century, these things still happen, right? So in Malaysia, for instance, I mean, the NGOs are very, very active. So any person who's trafficked, regardless of whether the person is a foreigner or local or whatever, people are quite concerned about it. And they do raise issues with either SUHAKAM, with the various NGOs, and these issues will be highlighted by the press, for instance, and it does capture media attention. And unfortunately for us, sometimes that's the only way enforcement takes place, because there's enough pressure on them.
Right. It's only when it gets reported then all eyes on that particular case then. Anyway, unfortunately, this is the end of the episode. I want to thank again our guests here that's on set. First from Project Liberate Malaysia Chain Program Coordinator Officer.
Program officer.
Thank you so much, Melissa, for being on Beyond the Headlines.
Welcome.
We have also SUHAKAM's Commissioner, Mr. Ragunath Kesavan. Thank you so much, Mr. Ragunath. I hope this is not the last time
No,
we'll be
please
seeing
do.
you.
Please invite us. We'll come.
And thank you also, Ilya Masha, our reporter. Now, she will definitely be, following up on the developments, not just on Mala's case, but other human rights issues as well. We appreciate your efforts. And to our audience, if you like this particular episode, don't forget to like, comment, subscribe. Don't forget to also turn on the notification bell if you haven't already. You're not going to just get Beyond the Headlines updates. Other news reports from NSC Online will also be delivered to you. Follow us on Instagram, Facebook, X, as well as Threads. My name is Amalina Kamal, and I'll see you next week. Thank you so much.